Hello and welcome to the How Not to Play limited set review. So my basic plan for this video is to go over each of the limited archetypes and look at some of the cards that you are likely to see in your draft, in your sealed pool, that you're going to want to pick up for each of these different archetypes. And then look at what one of these draft decks might look like. But first, Murders at Karlov Manor is the first time we are going to see these play boosters. So let's look at what a play booster is first. Essentially, it is a combination of our standard draft boosters that we've been familiar in playing with since Magic started, essentially. um, and the set boosters that feature a lot of special collectible cards, like uh, foils, the list cards, special guest cards, and whatnot. And so when you open up your play booster, you will get 15 cards. Six of them are guaranteed commons, three of them are guaranteed uncommons, and one of them is a guaranteed rare or mythic from the set that you open the play booster, in this case Markov Manor, but going forward, play boosters are going to be the standard issue. Um, in addition to your commons, uncommons, and rares, there will be one basic land slot, which can be full art. And then there are three other, well, four other, one of them being your token card, but three other slots to really look at. One of them is going to be the list slot, which has the potential of being a rare. And then there are two wild card slots. One is a foil guaranteed. The other one is not guaranteed to be foil, but it is still going to be a wild card slot that could be any rarity in the set. So these play boosters do have the potential to have up to 4 rares total if you high roll and you get a rare list card, a rare in your rare slot, a rare foil, and a rare non-foil wild card. It is possible. Don't count on it, but it is possible. But generally, each play booster is going to have one rare, a bunch of commons, some uncommons, your basic land, and here's what you're going to go with. In a standard draft, you will open 3 packs. You'll be picking one card out of each pack. And so your total pool to build your deck with will contain 3, maybe 4, possibly more rares or mythics, uh, roughly 12 uncommons, 24 commons, and then of course you can fill your deck out with unlimited basic lands from your local game store's pool. And so from this deck pool um, of 3 or 4 rares, 12 uncommons, 24 commons on draft, about double that if you are on a sealed pool when you open up 6 packs. You're going to want to build your 40 card deck. Generally, you're going to want to have about 17 basic lands, 16 to 18 creatures, 3 or 4 removal spells for your opponent's big bombs, and then 2 to 3 combat tricks that you can play to kind of help combat go in your favor, uh, to create your 40 card total deck. And so we're going to look at what some of these different archetypes, what their basic deck shell is going to look like. Because your rares are generally going to determine which archetype you go into, and you're going to play pretty much every rare that you pull, because why else would you pull them if you're not going to play them? I'm not going to focus on rares in this video, because you're only going to get 3 out of like 40 or 50, maybe 60 possible rares that you could get. And so going over all of the different rares is just going to be a waste of time. We're going to focus on those commons and uncommons that are going to make up the bulk of your deck in each of these archetypes. So in Azorius, you will be focusing on the detective's creature type. So it's going to be a lot of detective tribal, clue tokens, stuff like that. And so this is going to be, I think, the basic creature package that you're going to want to look for if you end up going to the Azorius route. First of all, you've got Fuss and Bother, particularly Bother, is going to be the split card that focuses on Azorius. Create 3 Thopters with flying, surveil 2. It's just kind of that top end, get some flyers in going to get at your opponent. Doesn't really flavor with the archetype too well, but it is still a good card. And since you are white-blue and these are split mana symbols, you can cast the Fuss side as well for 1 mana plus 2 to put a +1 counter on each attacking creature you control. You cannot cast both halves. In this set, you will cast one or the other, either Fuss or Bother. But that's going to be true in all of these archetypes where you see these split cards. But that also means that you don't have to pick the Azorius archetype. If there is a blue-green split card and you want the blue side of it, you can play that in your white-blue deck. Uh, like with Boros here, it's white-red, but you can play the Boros side if you want because you have white. So these split cards are going to offer a lot of versatility. So definitely look for those, even if they're not in your specific color pair. As long as they splash into your color pair, they are still going to be good cards to look at. Private Eye is going to be our signpost card here for the Azorius Detectives deck. He has that Lord effect, so other detectives gain +1/+1 static. And then whenever you draw your second card each turn, you can make one of your detectives unblockable. So once again, we get that creature types matters for our detectives deck. Along those same lines, we've got Projector Inspector is going to be a very good card to look at in your detectives deck because whenever he or another detective enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card. If you do, discard a card. Right away, you're triggering your Private Eye. Call a Surprise Witness is a great way to recur either your Private Eye, your Projector Inspector, or honestly the majority of your deck. If something dies, gets milled over, put into your graveyard, you get to return it to your hand, or you get to return it to play for only 2 mana. Plus, it gets flying. So it becomes a great attacker with evasion. So Call a Surprise Witness, definitely a great card, not only in Azorius, but really in just about any deck with white. If you can find Call a Surprise Witness, that is just a great way to get stuff back out of the graveyard. In addition to those main cards, you are going to want to fill your deck with a lot of other detectives. Mistway Spy, it has that disguise when it turns face up. You have that chance to investigate. Novice Inspector, ETB Investigate. You're drawing those clue cards. Cold Case Cracker, when it dies, investigate. So you've got all these different ways of creating these clue tokens. For those not familiar, clue token is an artifact that you can sacrifice by paying 2 mana, and then it lets you draw a card. And so this extra card advantage is really going to help you to find more detectives, play more detectives, go through your deck with Projector Inspector, with Private Eye, and just keep getting that uh, card advantage to be able to flood the board. Since you are drawing so many cards with clue tokens, Living Conundrum is a potential win con for your deck. If you would draw a card while your deck has no cards in it, you skip that draw, which means that you do not lose the game for emptying out your deck. And if you do get a lot of clue tokens, if you do get a lot of investigations, uh, Projector Inspector keeps going off, you could easily draw through your entire deck over the course of a limited game. Having a Living Conundrum in your deck just as a one of is a great way to get that card. Um, as long as there are no cards in your library, Conundrum has base power up to 10/10 with flying and vigilance. So you can both attack, block, plus it has hexproof naturally, so it's very hard to get rid of. Just an amazing win condition for a deck that might draw itself out like the Azorius Detectives deck. So some other creatures that you might want to look for in your deck would be cards like Perimeter Enforcer. Not only is it flying lifelink, but whenever a detective enters the battlefield, it gains +1 till end of turn. Your deck is going to be full of detectives, plus Private Eye pumping it. You are going to get this card pumped every turn. Most of your detectives are going to be 1 power, 2 power creatures. So a card like Market Watch Phantom, in addition to being a detective on its own, whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield, it gains flying. So it gets that evasion so that you can really punch in with it. Inside Source, while not a detective, does create a detective token when it enters the battlefield. Plus, it has that ability to pump a detective by giving it +2 and vigilance until end of turn. So these are all going to be great supporting cards for your Azorius Detectives deck. But creatures aren't the only things to look out for. You're definitely going to want to get a decent removal package. Some of the best Azorius removal cards were going to be something like Makeshift Binding is an Oblivion Ring. Make Your Move, that Destroy Evil effect. No More Lies is a great counter spell that also exiles the spell. And Not on My Watch is just going to be your standard white exile target attacking creature. So these are all going to be amazing removal options for your Azorius deck. So be sure to look for those coming around the bend as well. One of the cycles in Murders of Karlov Manor are these case cards. And so you will see case cards for each color, both at rare and uncommon. They all function relatively the same way. They have their static ability on top. So for Case of the Pilfered Proof, whenever a detective enters the battlefield, put a +1 counter on it. So your detective will enter the battlefield as a 2/2. Case of the Pilfered Proof will trigger, along with anything else that cares about 2 power creatures entering the battlefield. And then it'll get a +1 counter, and you'll have a 3/3 detective. On your end step, Case of the Pilfered Proof will check to see if the solve condition has been met. To solve this particular case, you just need 3 or more detectives on the battlefield. If that is the case, then the case becomes quote unquote solved and its last text box becomes active. So if 1 or more tokens would be created, you also get a clue token in addition. So if you create a detective token with inside source, then that detective token comes into play with a clue token. If you investigate with Novice Inspector, you not only get 1 clue token for investigating, but you get a second clue token for having this case solved. And so definitely look for this case in particular or other cases that might help your Azorius deck. One of the more interesting detectives, I think, that Azorius can really make use of is Agency Outfitter. It is a 6-drop flying creature, and when it enters the battlefield, you can search your library, graveyard, and hand for a card named Magnifying Glass and or Thinking Cap. So you could get one of them, or you could get one of each of them. And then they just go right onto the battlefield. So Magnifying Glass lets you just investigate at will for 4 mana. Thinking Cap is an equipment. It equips for 1 onto a detective, which your deck is going to be full of, and it gives that creature +1/+2 permanently. So, I mean, these are both very good artifacts that you can look for with Agency Outfitter. You get them both for free. So, definitely look for those 2 artifacts if you plan on putting Agency Outfitter into your deck, because that is just amazing value. Speaking of value and combat tricks, removal spells aren't the only thing you can put in your deck. Go ahead and look for some of these combat tricks. Auspicious Arrival gives +2 and Investigate. Deduce, draw a card, investigate. Burden of Proof gives a detective you control +2/+2, or it has the versatility of making one of your opponent's creatures a 1/1 that can't block your detectives. On the Job gives you that rally effect where everything gets +2/+1 till end of turn, plus you get to investigate, building that clue token. Curious Inquiry lets one of your creatures investigate whenever it hits your opponent. So if you're making things unblockable with your private eye, put Curious Inquiry on whatever is attacking, and you can investigate every turn. So these are just some amazing combat tricks or effects that you can put on your creatures to just help turn the tide, push your advantage, whatever you need to do to kind of keep your opponent off the scent. In addition to just general creatures, there are some lands to look for as well. Escape Tunnel is going to be the evolving wilds of the format. It's simply tap, sack, search for any basic land, put it onto the battlefield. But it also has that second caveat if you don't need to fix your mana base, that you can make a creature with power 2 or less unblockable this turn. So since most of your creatures are going to be lower power, this is a great way to push through those extra couple points of damage. Also of note, Scene of the Crime is an artifact clue land. So with Scene of the Crime, because it's a clue, you can actually sacrifice it to draw a card at any point, just like you can with any clue. But if you don't need to do that, it also lets you add 1 mana of any color by tapping an untapped creature you control. So it is really good mana fixing as well if you're wanting to splash into other colors for some different bomb rares that you might get. So those are some of the good cards to look for to build out your Azorius Detectives shell. Obviously, whatever bomb rares you pull out of your draft or out of your limited packs, you're going to play. So just cut whatever cards didn't make it around or whatever cards that just kind of don't measure up to whatever your rares can do. And then you've got yourself a good, solid Azorius Detectives tribal deck. The Boros archetype features, well, the battalion mechanic. It doesn't actually say battalion, but that's what the mechanic is. As we see with Meddling Youths, our signpost card for Boros, whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, which is what the battalion mechanic is, you get to investigate. We saw that in the detectives deck. You make that clue token, you can sacrifice it to draw a card. But with the Boros deck, you are going to want to look at having 3 or more creatures on the board that can attack all at once. So different cards that have that caveat on there would be Karlov Watchdog. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, creatures you control gain +1/+1 till end of turn. Seasoned Consultant. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, itself gets +2/+0 till end of turn. So different cards like that that care about creatures attacking. To help turn on your attack with 3 creatures battalion command, you're going to want to look for different cards that create creature tokens. So here we see Inside Source, this time for the red-white deck instead of the blue-white deck for detectives. Yes, it creates that 2/2 blue detective creature token, but we don't really care about it being a detective in this deck. We just care that it's an extra body on the field that we can attack with. Harry Dronesmith creates a Thopter artifact creature every turn. So that is another creature that can attack. Person of Interest creates, once again, that 2/2 detective token. So it brings with him a second body that can attack every turn. So you want to bring in these creatures that create tokens to help get you bodies on the field to trigger those battalion commands from your other cards. There are some cards, like Dog Walker, that have a disguise mechanic. Disguise, we may remember, is a lot like the morph mechanic, where you play it face down for 3 mana as a 2/2 creature with Ward 2, and then at any point you can pay the disguise cost to flip it face up. A card like Dog Walker, when it is turned face up, you create 2/1/1 dog tokens. Those tokens can then be used on your next turn to attack with 3 or more creatures. Forum Familiar, once again, one of those disguise cards. When you turn it face up, you can bounce something back to your hand. For example, one of your token producers, so that you can then recast it, get your token again. And then to kind of help enable these disguise creatures, Goblin Mask Maker, whenever it attacks, for the rest of the turn, your face down spells or your disguise spells will cost 1 mana less. So instead of paying 3 mana for this disguised creature, it'll only cost 2. So you could actually put down Dogwalker plus Forum Familiar for 4 mana instead of 6. And so while Disguise is not a main mechanic of the Boros deck, definitely splashing into it for these key cards like Dogwalker, Forum Familiar can certainly help build that token plan. The case that makes the most sense, I think, for the Battalion deck is going to be Case of the Gateway Express. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature that you don't control, and each creature you control deals 1 damage to that creature. So it's a very big pile-on type of removal effect. If you happen to have a single Death Touch creature out, then that will kill just about anything because of the Death Touch. Your creature is the one dealing the damage, not the case. Very important to note that. To solve the Gateway Express, all you have to do is attack with 3 or more creatures, which is what you're trying to do with this deck anyway. And once you've solved this case, then you get that Anthem effect, where all of your creatures gain that +1 power to just attack for extra damage. In addition to Case of the Gateway Express acting like a removal spell, being Boros, you have access to wonderful removal spells like Lightning Helix, Shock. Red just has oodles of burn, so your removal options are going to be all over the place. So be sure to look for that. Get up your removal package. Uh, we saw with the Detectives deck the split card Fuss and Bother. Here with the Boros deck, the Fuss side can really shine. So we want to flood the board with a lot of creatures and swing in with a lot of creatures at once. Fuss lets you put a +1 counter on each attacking creature you control, so they all get that +1 counter permanently. Or if your opponent might have you stalled out, you are running white, you can cast the Bother side if you need to create those 3 Thopter tokens with flying to get over a stalled board. So, I mean, once again, even though you're not Azorius, you can cast the Azorius side simply off of a straight white mana base. Other combat tricks that you might want to look for, Felonious Rage gives +2 in haste. When it dies, you get a detective token. So even if your creature does lose the combat or does die in combat, you still get that creature token back. On the Job, once again, gives that mass pump to all of your creatures. The Chase is On gives +3 and first strike. Not to mention that investigates, plus on the job also investigates to help you draw that extra card. Demand Answers lets you sacrifice an artifact or discard a card to draw 2 cards. So you're getting that card replacement effect. Due Diligence will actually pump 2 creatures and give them both vigilance so they can both attack and defend that turn. So all of these combat tricks are going to help out your Boros deck. Um, Especially like on the job, chases on those first strike pump spells are just going to be amazing to help you survive combat, because you are going to want to be in the red zone as much as possible. Once again, Escape Tunnel is really good in this deck because most of your creatures, again, are going to be lower power. So you can sacrifice Escape Tunnel, make a creature with power 2 or less unblockable, swing in, use your pump spell afterwards to add that +2/+1, add that +3/+0, whatever you've got, to then pump it up and deal those extra points of damage. Scene of the Crime, once again, is a clue that you can sacrifice later to draw a card, or that color fixing to add mana of any color. Once again, just really good lands to look at to shore up your mana base. And so this is what I think your Boros Battalion shell is really going to look like. You've got your Meddling Youths, your Signpost card. Your Dog Walker is going to be really good inside source to keep flooding the board with tokens. Lightning Helix, if you can pull it, is going to be amazing removal. If not, Shock is going to be a staple. And so if you're running Boros, these are the kind of cards that you're going to be looking for. Our Dimir deck, once again, likes to use clues, but they're doing it in a slightly different way. Our signpost for Dimir is going to be Curious Cadaver. It is a 3/1 for 4 flying zombie detective that when you sacrifice a clue, you can return it from your graveyard to your hand. So you can attack with it, you can block with it, remove something big. The next time you sacrifice a clue, you just get it right back. Other cards that really go well with this deck are going to be cards like Furtive Courier. As long as you've sacrificed an artifact this turn, aka a clue token, it becomes unblockable. And then whenever it attacks, you get to draw a card, discard a card. Undercity Eliminator. When it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice an artifact or a creature, so one of those spare clue tokens you have laying around, to exile target creature an opponent controls. So you get that other uses for the clue tokens rather than just drawing a card. You get to use them for these other effects, like a removal or making your creatures unblockable. And so that is what Dimir is going to use those clues for in a more controlling shell. Our big top end finishers for the Dimir clue control deck, aside from whatever rares you pull, are going to be cards like Persuasive Interrogators. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, it could be to its own effect, it could be to one of these other effects that we've seen, but whenever that clue gets sacrificed, your opponent gets 2 poison counters. So once you've sacrificed 5 clues, your opponent loses. Because you are going to be sacrificing clues, you're going to be drawing extra cards. Living Conundrum, once again, that 10/10 flying, hexproof, vigilance, beat stick is going to really close out a game fast by damage if you either don't find an interrogators or you just don't happen to cast it this game. Once again, those are just going to be some really good finishers for your Dimir clue deck. Other creatures of note that you might want to put into your deck would be a creature like Fairy Snoop. It's got that disguise on there, so you pay 3, put it face down as a 2/2 ward 2, and then whenever you turn it face up, you basically get to impulse. You look at the top 2 cards, put one into your hand, the other into your graveyard. Unscrupulous Agent. When it enters the battlefield, your opponent exiles a card from their hand. You get that hand disruption for only 2 mana plus a creature. And then that creature can either chump block, you can sacrifice it later on to your Undercity Eliminator to exile one of your opponent's creatures, whatever you need to do with it. Some other really good cards to look for in your Dimir clue control deck. The Case of the Filched Falcon is going to be a good one. When it enters the battlefield, you investigate, so you get that clue token right away. All you have to do is have 3 or more artifacts, aka clue tokens, hanging around in order to solve the case. And once you do, you get a 4/4 flyer on the battlefield. And so that is just going to be a really good clock in the air that's going to be really hard for your opponent to take care of. Once again, Curious Inquiry. We've got that really good evasive card in Furtive Courier. Putting Curious Inquiry on it will just ensure that you're able to sacrifice that clue every turn to continue making it unblockable. Deduce, once again, draw a card, investigate. Not only do you draw a card, which every control deck wants to do, but you also get that clue token that you can use to make Furtive Courier unblockable. You can use to solve the case of the Filched Falcon. Eliminate the Impossible also investigates, shrinks your opponent's creatures, and also removes Suspect, which is a mechanic that makes your opponent's creature semi-unblockable. It gives it menace. So you have to block it with 2 creatures. Um, so you could eliminate the Impossible, shrink your opponent's creatures, line up 1-for-1 blocks, and just really decimate your opponent's board. Toxin Analysis gives a creature Death Touch and Lifelink along with that investigation for 1 mana. That is amazing for a common. So all of these tricks are going to be wonderful to look at in your clue control deck. But tricks aren't the only thing up your sleeve. You're also going to want these removal spells to interact with your opponent's board. Reasonable Doubt is going to be your go-to counter spell for the deck. Not only does it counter your opponent's spell unless they pay 2 additional mana, but you also get to suspect a target creature. You could suspect one of your own creatures to give it menace. If your opponent only has 1 creature on the board, that's going to make it essentially unblockable. Long Goodbye is an uncounterable removal spell. Destroy a creature or planeswalker with mana value 3 or less. As we've seen, there are a lot of good cards and a lot of signpost cards that are at 3 mana or less. So this is a really good, cheap removal spell. And of course, what would Murders at Karlov Manor be without the title card of Murder? If there was ever a set to reprint this card, this is the one to do it. And your Dimir control deck is going to want as much murder as they can fit into their deck. Once again, you're going to look for these lands, Escape Tunnel, Scene of the Crime. These are going to be in pretty much every deck. You're going to want them for pretty much every deck. Just the colorless clue token off Scene of the Crime, the Evolving Wilds off of Escape Tunnel, being able to make one of your creatures unblockable is just amazing. So you're definitely going to be looking at these cards really in pretty much any deck you want. It's a free slot, throw it in there, make 8 islands, 8 swamps, 1 escape tunnel, good to go. I mean, really the land base is just going to be so good. Um, put in Scene of the Crime, you could even splash in whatever you want. I'm just going to be saying this literally every deck because these cards are just going to be so phenomenal. Definitely pick at least 1 or 2 up as they're going around the table. And so this is going to be the general shell for your Dimir Clue control deck. Uh, Toxin Analysis is just going to be a great removal card, removed out for your counterspell murders, Deduce, Inquiry, Cadaver, Fairy Snoop, Furtive Courier is going to be amazing, Unscrupulous Agent for that hand discard, and then Persuasive Interrogators, Living Conundrum as your big finishers, along with just whatever rares that you happen to pull out of your pack. And so you're going to get a very strong clue control playstyle. The Golgari deck focuses on the collect evidence mechanic. So you'll see a signpost card like Insidious Roots. Creature tokens have tap to add 1 mana of any color. Whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a plant token, which then can tap for any color. And then you put a +1 counter on each plant you control. So if you're continually moving creature cards out of your graveyard, then you'll keep creating all of these plants. They'll keep getting bigger. Like we said, Golgari is using this collect evidence mechanic, which is new to Murders at Karlov Manor. So, what that is, whenever something says collect evidence, like our Hedge Whisperer here on the right, collect evidence 4, for example. To collect evidence 4, you will exile cards, any cards, creatures, sorceries, whatever, as long as it has total mana value of 4 or greater from your graveyard. So it could be two mana cards, it could be 1 4 mana card, it could be a 5 mana card. Um, so you're going to be removing these cards from your graveyard to fuel these collect evidence cards. As you're doing that, Insidious Roots will make you plant tokens. Chalk Outline, whenever one or more creatures leave your graveyard, you'll get a detective creature, and then you'll investigate for that clue token. Clue tokens are amazing. Um, and so then those are kind of the cards that you're going to want to look for to take advantage of collecting this evidence. Of course, to pull cards out of your graveyard, you're going to have to put cards into your graveyard. And we can do that through the returning mechanic of Surveil, which we see here on Snarling Gorehound. Whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield, you Surveil. And so you've got cards like Gorehound will trigger himself. Festerleech, whenever he damages a player, you mill 2 cards. You keep fueling your graveyard. So these are all different ways that you can put cards into your graveyard. Another way, Topiary Panther, is actually the only land cycler in this set. So rather than having one for each color, Topiary Panther is it. You pay 2 mana and you can search your library for any basic land. Not just a forest, you could get your swamp too. And then that 6 mana cost creature is in your deck. You can then remove it to fuel your collect evidence. By doing so, you'll trigger your Insidious Roots, you'll trigger your Chalk Outline, and you'll make those extra creature tokens that you can then push through. Of note, when those creature tokens enter the battlefield, it's a 0/1 plant token, it's a 2/2 detective token. They will both trigger your Snarling Gorehound, which you can then surveil twice to put more cards into your graveyard to then collect for evidence later. Since you're putting cards into your graveyard, a card like Macabre Reconstruction will actually take 2 creature cards out of your graveyard to put into your hand. So if something goes to your graveyard that you would rather have on the field, let's say you want to cast your Topiary Panther, you can cycle it in the early game, bring it back with Macabre Reconstruction later, and then not only do you have that Panther now, but you're also triggering your Insidious Roots. You're also triggering your Chalk Outline, because those cards are being removed from your graveyard. Another great combat trick for Golgari is going to be Presumed Dead. Until end of turn, target creature gains +2/+0, and when it dies, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control and suspect it. So it dies, it goes to the graveyard, and then it immediately gets removed from the graveyard to go back into play, triggering Roots, triggering Chalk Outline, plus now you have that creature as a suspect. A Rebel Belt Maverick, once again, a great card for your Golgari deck. When it enters the battlefield, you Surveil, so you get that chance to put those 2 cards into your graveyard that you can then remove for evidence later. And then he has the ability to exile himself from your graveyard to, to put a +1 counter on any creature that you control. So that will also trigger your Roots, it'll trigger your Outline to create your creature tokens. So those are all different ways that you can get cards out of your library without collecting evidence. Another card would be your split card for this Golgari deck, Cease and Desist. Cease says to exile 2 cards from a single graveyard. That could be your graveyard, thus triggering your Roots, or it could be from your opponent's graveyard. If your opponent is playing a collect evidence deck, you could exile their 2 highest cost cards, so that way they can't use it to collect their own evidence. And then once you do exile those cards, Target player gains 2 life and draws a card. Generally, you're going to want to pick yourself for that. Alternatively, it does have that desist portion, uh, where you can destroy all artifacts or enchantments if your opponent happens to have a lot on the field. But generally, cease is the way you're going to go. Once again, we've seen that black especially has a bevy of removal spells at their disposal. Soul Enervation is a great one for the Golgari deck. When it enters the battlefield, a creature gains -4/-4. That's going to kill pretty much anything on the board. But once again, it has that static line of text that whenever a creature leaves your graveyard, you get to leech that life off of your opponent, which makes it more than just a removal spell. It also makes it a source of incidental damage. Gorgon's Kiss. When this case enters the battlefield, you destroy a creature that was dealt damage this turn. If 3 or more creature cards were put into your graveyard from anywhere. So you could surveil those creature cards. You could cycle your Topiary Panther. They could just all die in combat. Whatever happens to put 3 cards into your graveyard will solve the case of the Gorgon's Kiss, giving you a 4/4 Death Touch lifelink. Other spells you might want to look at for your Golgari deck would be cards like Extracted Confession, which has that Collect Evidence on it. So if you collect evidence while you cast this card, you get to power up the spell. So for example, if you just cast Extracted Confession, your opponent gets to choose which creature to sacrifice. If you collect evidence, then they are forced to sacrifice their highest power creature. If they happen to have that Living Conundrum, that 10/10 flying, hexproof, whatever that you can't kill, Extracted Confession actually could kill it because that would make your opponent sacrifice it. And then they draw off of an empty library and lose the game. Bite Down on Crime is another good card with Collect Evidence. If you do collect evidence 6, then the spell only costs 2 to cast. And it's going to be your basic bite spell. Your creature powers up, deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. You remove your opponent's blockers, you bite down on crime, and then you can just swing in with whatever you've got and just get a huge tempo advantage. And so this is what I think your general Golgari collect evidence deck is going to look like. You're going to get these cards like Insidious Roots, like Chalk Outline are going to be very big players. Soul Enervation as well. Whenever cards leave your graveyard, this happens. Along with cards like Snarling Gorehound, that Surveil mechanic, the milling off of Festerleech to put cards into your graveyard. And then the collect evidence payout cards to really take them out. And so if you find that your rares are pushing you into a Golgari path, then these are the types of cards you're going to want to look at. Topiary Panther, while being a common, I assume is going to be highly contested as the only land cycler in the set, so be sure to pick up that as well. Having that 6-drop, as we saw, a lot of the Collect Evidence is like Collect Evidence 6, Collect Evidence 4, something like that. So cycle this on turn 2, and now you've got that 6-drop just waiting to be collected. We talked about the disguise mechanic a little earlier. The Gruul archetype is really going to focus on that. Our signpost card, Tin Street Gossip, is a 4/4 for 4 that taps for 2 mana that you can use to either cast face down spells or to turn them face up. So a card like Goblin Maskmaker that makes those face down spells 1 less to cast means that Tin Street Gossip can put down a disguised creature by himself. So if you have a disguised creature like Riftburst Hellion, you can pay 3 mana normally to put it face down as a 2/2 creature with Ward 2. You can then turn it face up at any point for its disguise cost. So you attack with Goblin Maskmaker, you tap Tin Street Gossip for 2 mana. Riftburst Hellion is now a 2/2 Ward 2. The next turn, you turn it face up, and you now have a 6/7 reach creature. I mean, and that's really what this Gruul deck is wanting to do. You put down these disguised creatures for cheap, turn them face up with a huge body to just overwhelm your opponent. So to help out with this plan, you're going to want to look for, once again, a lot of these disguised creatures. But specifically cards like Nervous Gardener. When it gets turned face up, you get to tutor a land. Flourishing Bloomkin. When it gets turned up, you search specifically for 2 forests, and its power and toughness is going to be equal to the number of forests you control. So if you do find yourself with Flourishing Bloomkin, you might want to be a little bit more forest heavy in your mana base, but generally, a lot of your tutor spells are going to be tutoring for forests, specifically for Bloomkin. In addition, just big bodies like Greenbelt Radical. When it gets turned face up, you get a +1 counter on each creature you control, and not only that, but they gain trample as well. In addition to big bodies, you also can look for disguised creatures like Bulrak Clanbasher. Yeah, he's only a 3/2, but if he gets that +1 counter, he could be a 4/3. He naturally has trample and double strike, so he's actually 6 power plus whatever else you put on him. There are cards like Concealed Weapon, which you can put face down as a disguised creature, so you can attack with it as a 2/2 creature, and then if your opponent tries to kill it with a murder or something, you can reveal the disguise. It becomes a weapon that attaches to a creature like Bulrak Clanbasher to give it +3 power. Um, that would actually be pretty brutal, actually. Anyway, and so it kind of lets you cheat out creatures that aren't really creatures, like the Branch of Vitu-Ghazi. You can cast it face down as a disguised creature, attack with it a few times. If your opponent tries to kill it, just reveal the disguise. Oh, no, it's a land. Sorry, you can't kill it with your creature. And then you can start using it for mana. Speaking of removal, once again, Gruul has that red aspect, so you can get your staple removal spells like Shock. Since you are going to be ramping a lot in this Gruul deck, Torch the Witness is going to be an amazing fireball that you can use. Uh, Deals twice X damage to target creature, so it's twice as good as a fireball. Uh, and if you do any excess damage to the creature, you get a clue token as well. A hard-hitting question. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. So once again, you get that bite effect for only 1 green. So once again, really, really good removal options for the Gruul deck, especially since you're going to have a lot of these heavy hitters. That just makes hard-hitting question hit that much harder. See, cards like They Went This Way is a ramp spell that also lets you investigate. Very good for your Gruul deck. Like we said, you're going to get that ramp in there. Fanatical Strength gives +3 in trample. That's our giant growth of the format. Expose the Culprit will actually let you turn any face down creature face up for 2 mana. It will also let you redisguise or cloak any number of face-up creatures you have that disguise mechanic. So if you've got your entire board turned face up, you can expose the culprit to turn them all face down again, shuffle them up. Your opponent no longer knows which one was your big 7/6, and then you can just attack with all these disguised creatures, see which ones they block, and then maybe flip over or reveal one of your disguised creatures to kind of sneak out a win that way. With Breakout, you get to look at the top 6 cards of your library, reveal a creature with mana value 2 or less to put onto the battlefield with haste. Um, If you don't have a creature with 2 or less, you could still reveal it and put it into your hand. So it's a very good digging spell to help you find the card that you need. Uh, so definitely a very good card. And once again, we see our split card for Gruul in Hustle and Bustle. Uh, just a straight overrun effect with 6 mana. Creatures you control gain +2 and trample. Plus, you get to reveal one of your disguised creatures for free on top of that. So just a really, really good finisher card there in Bustle. The downside is it is sorcery speed, so you have to do the reveal before you declare attacks, so you don't really get that sneak attack there. But it is still a really good finisher for your Gruul deck that is going to want to have a lot of these big power creatures on the board. And so that, I think, is going to be what your general Gruul shell is going to look like. Um, I actually kind of forgot to look at Tunnel Tipster. We can see there at the end of our 2-drop pile. At the beginning of your end step, if a face-down creature entered the battlefield, it gets a +1/+1 counter. So it has the ability to grow over the course of the game. But most importantly, it's your mana dork of the format. We'll see him showing up in green decks throughout the format. If you do see that Tunnel Tipster, feel free to pick it up, even if you're not playing Disguise. But there are a lot of good green Disguise creatures that you can use. We saw the Nervous Gardener lets you tutor out some lands. Riftburst Hellion, a really big creature. Tin Street Gossip, your signpost. Goblin Mask Maker to make that initial drop that much cheaper. I mean, these are all going to be great cards for your Gruul Disguise deck. The Izzet archetype is going back to investigating, looking at those clue tokens, bringing up those artifacts. Uh, so you get cards like Detective Satchel whenever it enters the battlefield, investigate twice. Gleaming Gear Drake whenever it enters the battlefield, investigate. But the Izzet flair on the clue tokens is going to be it cares about artifacts being sacrificed. So with Detective Satchel, if you have sacrificed an artifact this turn, you can tap it to make a Thopter. Gleaming Gear Drake, whenever you sacrifice an artifact, it gets a +1 counter. Crime Novelist, whenever you sacrifice an artifact, it gets a +1 counter and gives you 1 red to your mana pool. I mean, if you sack 2 clues, you get your 3rd one for free with Crime Novelist on the board. So yeah, this is what we're going to look at. If you find that your rares are pulling you more into an Izzet artifact line, is finding cards like Detective Satchel, Gleaming Gear Drake, and Crime Novelist that can really take advantage of sacrificing those clue tokens. In your Izzet deck, a card like Harry Dronesmith is going to be that much better. Because on combat every turn, you get that 1/1 Thopter artifact token. And then at your end step, you sacrifice it, whether you attack with it or not. So not only can you attack with that 1/1 flyer, but it just gives you an extra artifact to sacrifice to trigger all of your sack abilities. Something like Reckless Detective. Whenever it attacks, you can sacrifice an artifact or discard a card to draw a card and pump him up to a 2/3 attacker. Gearbane Orangutan. When it enters the battlefield, you get that naturalize effect, or you can sacrifice an artifact to make him a 4/4 permanently. Plus, he has that reach ability naturally. So once again, just a really good outlet to sacrifice artifacts for value other than just drawing a card. Of course, we saw Furtive Courier in the Dimir shell. He works just as well in the Izzet shell because you're going to have all of these clue tokens that you're going to be sacrificing. You can make him unblockable, give him Curious Inquiry, just like we said with the Dimir shell. Give him +1/+1, and whenever he deals combat damage to a player, investigate. So pre-combat, you sacrifice a clue, draw a card, attack with your unblockable now Furtive Courier, deal 4 damage with Curious Inquiry, giving him that +1/+1. Investigate to get that clue token back, and you're all set up to do it again next turn. Case of the Filched Falcon, once again, really good with your Izzet deck because you're making those clue tokens, and not just clue tokens, but to solve this case, you just need 3 or more of any artifacts. If you get 3 Thopters off of your Detective Satchel, you can solve your case with Thopters. It doesn't have to be clue tokens, although it does investigate when it comes into the battlefield. You do get that clue token, and then once it is solved, you can sacrifice it to turn one of your spare clue tokens into a 4/4 flying bird. So with blue in the Izzet shell, once again, we can use Deduce to draw a card, investigate, make that clue token. But we also add in the red package for removal spells like Galvanize. If you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn, it deals 5 damage for only 2 mana. So once again, you've got those clue tokens. You could even sacrifice it to a Reckless Detective attacking. Suspicious Detonation. If you have sacrificed an artifact this turn, costs 3 less to cast. So once again, 2 mana for 4 damage, uncounterable spell. So once again, just really good different ways of playing around with these clue tokens and sacrificing these clue tokens just to really benefit you and your deck. We saw Hustle and Bustle with the Gruul deck. Once again, with the Izzet deck, you can force one of your opponent's creatures to attack, or you could force one of them to block. If you've got your 4/4 orangutan sitting there and your opponent's got their 3/1 flyer that they don't really want to attack with, you could cast Hustle, make them attack, block it with your 4/4, or you could swing in with your 4/4, make them block with their 2/2 or something that you really want to get off the field. And so Hustle can really kind of create an advantageous combat situation for you. Or if it's late game, you've got a lot of Thopters out, you can go ahead and cast that Bustle for 2 red +4, get that overrun effect. You might not have any creatures to turn face up because you're not really playing Disguise in the Izzet shell, but you can still cast that overrun effect on the Bustle side if you don't need to hustle. Scene of the Crime, once again, is not just a land, but also a clue itself. And being an artifact means that it will once again trigger all of your sacrifice effects. So just a really good card to put in your Izzet shell. So once again, this is what I think your Izzet shell is going to look like for your Artifacts and Sacrifice Matters deck. If you open up a lot of red or blue rares and mythics in your draft packs, in your sealed packs, these are going to be some of the cards that you're going to look at to help fill out your 40. The Orzhov deck, once again, kind of wants to feature this disguise mechanic. Whenever you cast a creature with its disguise, like we said, you bring it into play face down as a 2/2 creature. What Orzhov wants is that 2/2 body. So you get cards like our Signpost, Wisp Drinker Vampire, that whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life, you gain 1 life. Late game, you can use that mana sink to give all of your creatures with power 2 or less Death Touch and Lifelink to just do a really big swing to decimate your opponent's board if they do decide to block. If they don't block, then either way, you're going to be gaining this ton of life. But that's what Orzhov really cares about, is these 2 power creatures. So you've got cards like Market Watch Phantom. Whenever a creature power 2 or less enters the battlefield, it gains flying. Neighborhood Guardian, whenever 2 or less enters the battlefield, target creature gains +1/+1 till end of turn. Snarling Gorehound, whenever a creature 2 or less enters the battlefield, Surveil. Look at the top card, decide if you want it, throw it into your graveyard if you don't. In your Orzhov shell, you're going to want to look for these power matters, specifically low power matters cards to help go along with all of your disguise creatures. Speaking of which, you're going to look for disguise creatures like Night Drinker Moroi, Basilical Stalker, Alley Assailant. All of these creatures come into play as that 2/2 creature to trigger your vampire, to trigger your gorehound. And then when you go to attack with them, you can flip them face up for their disguise cost. Night Drinker becomes a 4-power flyer. Basilica Stalker, whenever it hits your opponent, you gain a life and surveil. On top of being a 3-power flyer, Alley Assailant, when it turns face up, you leech 3 life off of your opponent. That's before you've even attacked. And because Disguise can be used whenever you have priority, you could actually activate Wisp Drinkers 7 to give all creatures you control lifelink and death touch. And then if you have enough mana left over, you could reveal the Disguise on Night Drinker Moroi. It will still have that lifelink death touch, but now have 4 power instead of 2. And so that is an interesting byplay that you might be able to take advantage of, granted in the extreme late game, but still something to look at, knowing that Disguise bypasses the stack and can be activated anytime you have priority. In addition to those gotcha kind of disguise creatures, there's also cards like Museum Nightwatch, where if they are going to block your disguise creature, you can pay 2, turn him face up, and whenever he dies, you get that 2/2 detective token. So once again, you got that 2-power creature entering the battlefield, triggering all of your power stuff matters. Essence of Antiquity. If your opponent decides to kill some of your stuff, you could flip Essence of Antiquity, give all of your stuff hexproof until end of turn, untap it if your opponent is swinging in. He does have 10 toughness, so he is a really good blocker, even if that's the only thing that you're revealing him for is just so that he can block. Still, the rest of your creatures have that ability, and you can really kind of stop your opponent's attack dead in the water, in addition to giving everything hexproof to stop any of your opponent's removal. Once again, we see the branch of Vitu-Ghazi here as a disguised creature. You can put it into play as that 2/2 creature. And then if it's going to die either in combat or to a removal spell, you can reveal the disguise, get the 2 mana for flipping it face up, maybe flip up something else like your Museum Nightwatch, and kind of fizzle that removal spell that way. And being a land, it's not really going to affect your creature slots. So it'll just be like a different card in your mana base, and you can still use it for mana after that. Speaking of removal spells, once again, Case of the Gorgon's Kiss is really good with those 2/2 creatures um, as their face downside. Aren't really going to do a lot in combat, or you could attack into an opponent's big thing, they block it, you cast Case of the Gorgon's Kiss post combat, kill whatever their big thing was, and then as long as 3 or more cards were put into your graveyard, you can solve this case for that 4/4 Gorgon with Death Touch and Lifelink. Once again, that could just be through a big combat swing. It could be through different kill spells. It could be through milling, surveilling, just any way that you've got to put cards into your graveyard. With the white half of Orzhov, we have, once again, these good removal spells, like Not on My Watch, that exiles an attacking creature of any power. Make your move that destroys creatures with power 4 or greater, along with hitting any artifact or enchantment. So since you're going to have this board of predominantly low power creatures, having removal spells that can hit creatures of any power or greater power level is definitely going to be advantageous and something you're going to want to put in your Orzhov deck. So we see our split card for Orzhov being a push and pull. Push at sorcery speed, I don't really care for, but destroy any tapped creature. So your opponent attacks with something on your turn, you can push it right into the graveyard. If it's late game, your opponent has a pretty stocked graveyard, you could even use the pull side just for 2 black and remove two creatures from their graveyard or your graveyard onto the battlefield. They gain haste and then sack at the end step. So just different ways that you can manipulate the board by either killing their best thing with push, bringing back their best thing with pull. In addition, you've got Macabre Reconstruction that can get cards back out of your graveyard. Presumed Dead is a great combat trick with Orzhov Disguise, in that you can cast it on one of your face down creatures. It becomes a 4/2 for that combat, maybe trades with your opponent's 3/3, or even a 4/4. It dies, but then it comes back to the battlefield face up and suspected. So with menace. And so that's another great way of essentially flipping your cards without having to actually flip them. Although they don't get those when this card is turned face up triggers, um, because they're not getting turned face up, they are coming back from the graveyard. But when a card goes to the graveyard, it gets revealed, and then when it comes back from the graveyard, then it would be face up on your board as that 4/2 flyer, um, as that 3/4, as that 1/10, whatever your card is on the front side. And so this is really what I think your Orzhov Disguise shell is going to look like, with Case of the Gorgon's Kiss being really good, push-pull as your split card, um, Wisp Drinker Vampire is going to be your signpost, Presumed Dead, really good for combat tricks. Like we said, make your move some good removal. Just, once again, caring about those low power creatures. So if you find yourself through your rares leaning into Orzhov, these are the kinds of cards that you're going to want to really look for to fill out your shell. We have talked a little bit about the suspect mechanic, and that is what our Rakdos deck is going to embody. So when a creature is suspected, it gains menace and cannot block. So, for example, Runebrand Juggler, our signpost card, when it enters the battlefield, you suspect one creature you control. So, if Runebrand is the only creature you have at that time, then it will now be a 2/2 with menace and cannot block. So, since we're focusing on this suspect role in the Rakdos deck, we're going to, by default, go into a more aggro and more aggressive mindset. Runebrand Juggler also has the mana sink ability that you can sacrifice a suspected creature to deal -5 to target creature until end of turn. There's not a whole lot of creatures that's going to survive -5, -5. So it might also be good to put cards in your deck like Shady Informant that when it dies, it deals 2 damage to any target. So not only do you give -5 to something, but you can also shock something, protect. So you could deal, maybe get rid of a 7/7, or get rid of a 5/5 plus a 4/2. So I mean, honestly, really good card to have in a deck that cares about sacking is a card that has when it dies abilities. Once again, since you're going to be a more aggressive deck, having a card like Harried Dronesmith around that can provide that extra token every turn can give you either something to sacrifice or something to attack with. Either way, it's something that your deck is really going to want. So because the Rakdos deck really cares about having creatures suspected for abilities like Sack for -5, a card like Frantic Scapegoat is going to be amazing. When it enters the battlefield, it gets suspected. Whenever Another creature you control enters the battlefield. If Frantic Scapegoat is suspected, you can move that suspect onto a different creature. So, for example, your Repeat Offender. Once you cast Repeat Offender, Frantic Scapegoat could suspect it. And then Repeat Offender's ability, if it is suspected, it gets a +1 counter. Otherwise suspected. Normally, you would have to take a turn off to suspect it with a card like Frantic Scapegoat or even Person of Interest, which also, when it enters the battlefield, you suspect a creature. With either of those cards, you can bypass that initial activation and start off with this card immediately a suspect, so you can start pumping it and attacking with Menace. Of course, being red, we've got cards like Galvanize and Shock as a basic removal package. A really good case for our Rakdos deck is going to be Case of the Burning Masks. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to target creature an opponent controls. To solve, 3 or more sources you control need to have dealt damage. So that could be either through Case of the Burning Mask, dealing 3 damage to a creature an opponent controls, or any of your suspected creatures attacking during combat. It just has to deal damage. It doesn't matter what it's from or who it's to. It could be even Galvanize or Shock, dealing damage. It just has to be a source, not a permanent, just any source, dealing any damage to anything. And once solved, you can sacrifice it, exile the top 3 cards, and choose one to play this turn. So it's very easy to solve, but really you only get 1 card out of it. So maybe it's not so good, but that 1 card is probably going to be when you're top decking, and you get to choose the best card out of the top 3 to really get you out of the jam or finish off the game. Deadly Complication is a Rakdos removal spell. So it's 1 of each plus 1 of anything, and you can straight up destroy target creature, kind of like murder. Or, since it is Rakdos, it also lets you put a +1 counter on a suspected creature you control, and you can have it no longer be suspected. If you want to, that is a May ability. So if you want, you could put a +1 counter on a suspected creature you control and leave it suspected so that it can attack with Menace. But that also gives you the opportunity to remove suspected if you need that creature to block. And you get the option to choose both. So for 3 mana, you could murder plus get that +1 counter. So it's just an amazing card for this Rakdos Suspect deck. Aside from just straight up burn, there are other ways that your Rakdos Suspect deck can gain an advantage in combat. So first of all, we have the enchantment Convenient Target, which you can put on any creature, and it makes that creature suspected. So it gives it Menace, it gives it cannot block, plus it gives it +1/+1. So it gives you a very good attacker that you can start swinging with at only 1 mana. But normally, if that creature then dies in combat, that enchantment is gone, it's lost. But Convenient Target gives you the option for 3 mana to return it back to your hand. So at any point, you can make something else the suspect. The Chase is On offers you a great combat trick. Since Suspect is giving your cards Menace, by giving a creature first strike until end of turn with the Chase is On, you could actually disrupt your opponent's block. So let's say your Repeat Offender has grown to the point that your opponent really needs to kill it, and so he double blocks, which he has to for Menace, in order to kill the informant, in order to kill the offender. By casting Chases On, you give it that first strike ability. It can kill one of the blockers through first strike. The second blocker no longer has enough damage on its own to kill the repeat offender, and so you still keep it, you're able to keep pumping it, and your opponent is in an even worse spot now. So First Strike is a very good combat trick when you have a lot of menace going around, which this deck is going to do. Also, once again, we see this push-pull card. Push for 1 black plus 1 mana. You can destroy a tapped creature at sorcery speed, or for 6 mana, you can pull 2 creature cards from any graveyard, yours or your opponent's, back onto the battlefield, give them haste, swing in, sack them at the end of the turn, just for that really big finisher at the end of the game. And so once you add in your mana base, this is what I think your Rakdos Suspect shell is going to look like, with cards like Repeat Offender being able to grow, uh, Frantic Scapegoat, throwing around that Suspect, Convenient Target, a really good card if you can find it, uh, Runebrand Juggler, being able to sacrifice your suspects to destroy your opponent's creatures, combined with the general red, burn, black kill spells to open up the path for your menace suspects to plow on through and just really take over the board. With Selesnya, we are going back to that disguise mechanic with our signpost card, Sumala Sentry. Whenever a face down card is turned face up, he gets a +1/+1 counter. So does the card that you turned face up. Defenestrated Phantom, once again, is that showcases that disguise mechanic. So for 3 mana, you can play it face down as a 2/2 creature. And then at any time for its disguise cost, you can turn it face up. So with Sumala Sentry on the board, that would actually reveal into a 5/4 flyer, which is going to end the game pretty quickly, honestly. Since we are in green on Disguise, using a card like Tunnel Tipster, we kind of saw him in our Gruul deck a little bit there at the end. Um, if a face-down creature entered the battlefield under your control, he gets a +1/+1 counter. And he is your general mana dork for green this set. So once again, really synergizes well with green, gives you that extra ramp to really help you put down those disguise creatures, and then helps you turn them face up later on for value. So once again, you're going to want to look for these disguise creatures, like Branch of Vitugazi. We saw that before. You can turn it face up into a land to continue to ramp. It actually could give you 2 land drops in a turn if you end up getting really flooded in the early game, which I'm not sure how that helps, but it's something. Nervous Gardener helps you ramp. Flourishing Bloomkin lets you ramp. Um, can be really big if you have a heavy green base. So once again, just these different disguise cards to look for um, in that green ramp mana base. And of course, you can ramp into something like Greenbelt Radical, gives all of your creatures that +1 counter, plus trample till end of turn. And we've seen with Selesnya before, throwing around those +1/+1 counters is a general theme in Selesnya. Um, And so if you're putting a +1 counter on every creature you control, you're going to want a lot of creatures on the field. So getting cards like Inside Source, which is a 1/1 itself, it creates that 2/2 detective, gives you 2 creatures for 1 card. A Killer Among Us gives you 3 creatures for 1 card. Plus the rest of the card lets you play this little Among Us mini game where you've secretly picked one of them as a quote-unquote assassin, and if your opponent blocks your assassin, you can reveal it, give it 3/+1 counters, give it death touch, and it's just gonna be bad days for your opponent. For our removal package, Selesnya specifically has the card Buried in the Garden, which is um, an Oblivion Ring on a land, much like we've seen Ossification in the past. You enchant your land, you exile a creature, or actually any non-land permanent under it, and that's exiled for as long as Buried in the Garden exists. Of note, Buried in the Garden can enchant any land, even a non-basic land, whereas Ossification specified a basic land. So it's going to see a lot more standard play because of that, but also there are cards that destroy target non-basic land. Um, Not that I've seen so much in this format, but still, you might want to put it on a basic just in case. But in addition to having that exile or O-ring effect, it also lets whatever land you tap for an additional mana of any color. Not just what it tapped for, not just what it could produce, but any color, which really helps you splash in different colors. So, for example, Cease and Desist, you could have it splash black for the Cease portion to exile 2 cards from your opponent's graveyard. But really, we're going to be looking at this Desist portion for Selesnya, destroying all artifacts and enchantments. Uh, Not really sure how good this is going to be, since we actually do have different O-rings like Buried in the Garden and Makeshift Binding. This might get cut from your deck in place of some of your rares, because you are going to want those O-rings and you're not going to want those to really go away. But it could still see some byplay if your opponent is on like an Izzet Artifact deck, or if they're big on cases or something like that. It could still have some effect in your deck. So definitely keep it in the sideboard if nothing else. Speaking of cases, Case of the Trampled Garden is probably going to be our best bet here. When it enters the battlefield, put 2/+1 counters out among any creatures you control. If creatures have total power of 8 or greater, which with your go wide strategy and putting +1 counters everywhere shouldn't be too hard to get. Once it has been solved, whenever you attack, you just get to throw out an additional +1 counter on any attacking creature, plus give it trample till end of turn. Is really going to close out a game pretty quickly. Other cards to really look for, they went this way once again, is a ramp card. Lets you go get basic lands, plus investigate, call a surprise witness, lets you bring back your Sumala Sentry, lets you bring back your Tunnel Tipster, or just pretty much anything else on your lower end. So just really, really good cards to have just in general, especially in the Selesnya Disguise deck. And so this is what I think your disguise shell is really going to look like. Um, Sumala Sentry, once again, you want to focus very heavy on those disguise cards, like Forum Familiar, like your Flourishing Bloomkin, Nervous Gardener, Greenbelt Radical, Crowd Control Warden, Defenestrated Phantom, even Branch of Itugazi. Any of these face down creatures are going to grow Sumala Sentry whenever you flip them up, Tunnel Tipster whenever you put them down, and just really kind of grow this Selesnya deck. So if you find yourself going Selesnya for whatever rares you've pulled, these are some of the other cards that you're going to want to look for to help flush out your deck. With Simic, we see on our signpost card, Evidence Examiner, that we are once again on a collect evidence plan. So whenever you collect evidence, you investigate. So you get that clue token. So not only are we collecting evidence, but we're also drawing cards. Uh, so once again, we're going to want to fill up our graveyard as much as possible with cards like Aftermath Analyst. When it ETBs, you mill 3 cards. Later on in the game, you can sacrifice it to get all of the lands that ended up in your graveyard back onto the battlefield. So a really big ramp spell. Rebel Belt Maverick, once again, ETB's Surveil. Surveil is just another way that you can look at the top of your deck, sequence your draws, throw away cards that you either don't want or that you want to collect for evidence. Topiary Panther, once again, we see as a great card. Uh, A, for the cycling ability, you can throw it in your deck. B, as a 6 mana drop, it can collect evidence on pretty much anything. Um, and then C, if you don't cycle it and don't collect evidence from it, it's just a 6/5 trampler. It's just a really big beat stick. So it is just an amazing card, and even though it's at common, I don't see this card tabling at all. Sample Collector, once again, whenever it attacks, you can collect evidence to put a +1 counter on any creature you control, not just Sample Collector, but anything. Chalk Outline we saw earlier. Once again, whenever a creature card leaves your graveyard, you make that detective token, and then you investigate. So you get that clue token again as well that will help you draw more cards. And so these are some of the creatures that you're really going to want to look for in your Simic shell. As for combat tricks, you're definitely going to want to look for cards like Unauthorized Exit, what lets you bounce a permanent back to your owner's hand, so you get that tempo play. Plus, that Surveil lets you put a card into your graveyard that you can collect for evidence. Bite Down on Crime lets you collect that evidence to lower the mana cost to get that bite effect to deal damage to a creature you don't control to get it off the board. And in Simic, we get this counter spell in Repulsive Mutation. Essentially, it is blue, green, X. Put X +1 counters on target creature you control. X can be 0, mind you. And then counter target spell unless controller pays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So generally, the theory is you put a bunch of counters on your biggest thing. Your opponent doesn't have that much mana to pay. The spell gets countered. Honestly, if your opponent is tapping out for something really big, you could just cast this for 2, not put any counters out, and still counter your opponent's big threat. So it is a very good counterspell to pick up if you find yourself going Simic, just because it's a 2 mana counterspell. As far as cases go, once again, Case of the Trampled Garden is going to be a pretty good one for Simic. You get those +1 counters early out. You get creatures of total power 8 or greater, which you should be able to get eventually. And then you just get that +1 counter every turn just for attacking to help you close out the game. Um, Honestly, you could do Case of the Filched Falcon as well. If you find yourself getting a lot of clue tokens, it wouldn't be that hard to get yourself a 4/4 flyer. We've seen that before in the Detectives and the Izzet decks as well. So really, either one of those cases floating around the table would be very good for your Simic deck. Some other good combat tricks, like Behind the Mask. If you collect evidence, you can turn one of your opponent's creatures into a 1/1. Or without collecting evidence, you can turn one of your creatures into a 4/3. Either way, it will help you survive that combat, be a 1 mana trick that your opponent simply wasn't expecting, and just really help you blow out combat in your favor. And for our split card, once again, we see Flotsam Jetsam. Um, for Flotsam, mill 3 cards, fill up your graveyard, and then investigate. You get that clue token that will help you draw a card. Uh, Jetsam, you make your opponent mill 3, and then you can cast something from their graveyard for free. And so that's what I think our Simic Evidence deck is really going to be um, kind of looking at as far as those creatures, along with Living Conundrum, I think is going to be especially helpful here in the Simic deck. Um, Simply because you're going to be milling, you're going to be surveilling, you're going to be throwing so many cards into your graveyard, plus investigating and drawing more cards off of your clue tokens. You are really going to burn through your deck really quickly. So I think Simic actually has the best chance out of the 3 clue decks that we looked at. of making Living Conundrum stick and becoming that 10/10 flying vigilance hexproof beat stick that's going to finish off a game. Plus, if you have Case of the Trampled Garden on top of that, gives it trample as well. That is just going to be stupid broken. Um, and probably more powerful than even most rares you're going to find in the set. So really, really good there. This, I believe, is going to be kind of your core Simic uh, collect evidence deck. So that takes care of all 10 of our archetypes, but there are still a couple more decks that you might see roaming around. We have seen a lot of cases showcased through all of our different 10 archetypes. There are cases at uncommon and at rare. So there are at least going to be 12 or 13 different cases that you could find in your draft. So drafting a card like Case File Auditor would actually let you draft into, or perhaps build into if you're unlimited, a cases matter deck. So when it enters the battlefield and whenever you solve a case, you get to look at the top 6 cards of your library, pick any enchantment, which all of your cases are enchantments, but being in white, you could also get your Oblivion Ring spells. And then when you are casting cases, you can use mana as if it were any color. So you could put in black cases, red cases into your white-green deck, and you could literally play every case that you draft if you have a case file auditor on the field. So it's quite possible that you could see a cases matter deck. I'm not entirely sure how good it would be, but it would certainly be an interesting deck to play with and to play around. Another special card that I really want to see that is probably going to be more of a constructed play around than a limited one is Slime Against Humanity. This card cares about cards in exile and cards named Slime Against Humanity in your graveyard. So when you cast the spell, you get a 0/0 ooze token with trample, and then it gets a number of +1 counters equal to 2. So it's at minimum going to be a 2/2, plus the total number of cards in exile and in graveyard that are oozes or named Slime Against Humanity. So that's got a lot of words. It's going to be a build around, definitely. So you're going to want to put any number of cards named Slime Against Humanity in your deck. So you could have 40 slimes, 20 lands, and be good in your standard constructed deck, which we might do. Check out the channel for more info on that. Um, but in limited, I think this has the best home in the Simic deck, because Simic has those extra draw cards to help you draw into your Slime Against Humanity. You're probably only going to see a couple of these floating around the table, so having cards named Slime Against Humanity in your graveyard isn't probably going to be a thing. Having oozes in your graveyard probably isn't going to be a thing. You're really going to want to look at the cards you own in exile. And so if you can collect a lot of evidence, then you could get a really big tramply slime. So it really could be a solid finisher in your Simic deck. So that would be a really good deck to play around with. Um, I don't think you're going to see it very often in limited. You might see this card, but if you are playing against a Simic opponent, definitely keep this one in the back of your mind. We've seen a lot of new mechanics in Murder at Karlov Manor, and with new mechanics, some of them can seem broken. And generally, there are going to be different hate cards that you can sideboard in to kind of get around them a little bit. So the first one, and probably the major one in this set, is going to be Disguise. With Disguise, you play a face-down creature. God only knows what it is, and when your opponent attacks, it could turn into anything. Pompous Gadabout has hexproof on your turn, so your opponent can't kill him, whatever. But most notably, Pompous Gadabout cannot be blocked by creatures that don't have a name. That sounds really weird because all creatures have a name. But if you have a face down disguised creature, that disguised creature does not have a name because the name is on the face down side. Once you reveal the disguise, then that creature has a name and whatever. But as long as it's a face down disguised creature, it cannot block Pompous Gadabout. So if your opponent is playing a very heavy disguise deck, then maybe you want to bring Pompous Gadabout in from your sideboard for games 2 and 3. Uh, Lumbering Laundry is another card that you may want to look at if you are playing against a disguised opponent, because apart from being a disguised creature himself, he has the ability that you can pay 2 mana and look at all of your opponent's disguised creatures. Legitimately. Just pay 2 mana, let me see what you got under there. So a really good sideboard card if you're playing against Disguise to know what tricks your opponent might be sandbagging and to really line up your blocks to know which cards you might want to block. For example, if they've got that 3/2 double striker, you don't want them turning it up unblocked, so maybe you throw something in front of it that could kill it. In multiple decks, we have seen the collect evidence mechanic. Uh, this set does have Gravestone Strider, which I'm not going to say is a hard counter to collect evidence, but it is a card you might consider sideboarding in. At base value, it is a color fixer. You can pay 1 mana, turn it into any color you want. Um, Only once each turn, kind of iffy, but I mean, you can still put it in to help you splash different colors in your deck if you need to. But its big thing is you can exile him from your graveyard to exile a card from your opponent's graveyard, or from your graveyard too. So really, for 2 mana, you could exile him plus a different creature from your graveyard to trigger your whenever a creature leaves the graveyard mechanics, because he is a creature. But generally, you're going to want to exile him out of your graveyard to remove your opponent's Topiary Panther. Their big 6 mana, whatever their biggest mana value is, to hamper their ability to collect evidence. Absolving Lamasu is a creature that you can sideboard in to go against the Rakdos Suspect deck, or any decks that uses Suspect to throw around Menace to make blocking harder. When Lamasu enters the battlefield, it removes all suspects. So anything that did suspect it no longer is. Whenever it dies, you gain 3 life, and you can suspect a creature that your opponent controls. So they do kind of get it back if they can kill your Lamasu, but generally by then you've already ruined their attacks and kind of stabilized the game and gotten control back. Vengeful Tracker is another really good sideboard card against any of the clue decks that we have seen. Whenever an opponent sacrifices an artifact, Vengeful Tracker deals 2 damage to them. So they pay their 2 mana, they sacrifice their clue, they draw their card, they take 2 damage. So it's really going to make them think about when and where they sacrifice their clues. And not just their clues, any artifact. So it really hurts that Izzet deck that just likes sacrificing creatures for fun and profit. So Vengeful Tracker, once again, a really good sideboard card to keep in mind and bring back in on games 2 and 3 if your opponent showcases a lot of clues, a lot of artifact sack, and that kind of thing. So definitely keep these cards in mind. Maybe not for the main deck, but most times you play draft is going to be best 2 out of 3. So these are going to be great sideboard cards to keep in mind for those second and third games to really help hose your opponent's strategy. And so that's going to be my video today. Um, We've gone over a lot of the draft archetypes. I know this was a long video, but hopefully in the timestamps down below, you can go to whichever draft archetype really floats your boat, see what a lot of the good cards are to fill out your 40. Once again, I didn't really go over any rares in this video because your rares are going to determine more or less which archetypes you go into. And this video is just going to show you which other cards, which commons and uncommons, are going to be good for your deck to help fill out the other 40. So we've seen a lot of these sample draft decks for each of the signpost uh, archetypes, along with some of the special decks that might show up. Honestly, I would love to see somebody try out that Cases deck. Let me know how it goes. Throw down Slime Against Humanity. I would love to hear your thoughts on that card, along with what you think some of the best archetypes are. Go ahead, let me know in the comments below. While you're down there, put a like on this video if you want to see more like this for future sets. This was a pretty heavy video, both to make and record. So I'm probably not going to do this unless I get a lot of likes on there. So go ahead and smash that button. Let me know that this is what you want to see, and we'll do more of it. Um, if you want to see me maybe do 10 smaller videos instead of one large video, let me know in the comments below. I definitely read those and want to take your opinions to help make this channel better. So definitely give me some feedback on that, and I'll see y'all at Karlov Manor.